Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
As the U.S. faces rising global threats, a new warning from national security leaders is raising alarms at home. The National Security Leaders for America say recent layoffs at the State Department, impacting over 2,000 positions, could do lasting harm to U.S. foreign policy and national security. The group says rebuilding the diplomatic corps will require more than just hiring. It will take a generational investment in talent, training, and trust. Here with the details behind this position is former Ambassador Gordon Gray. Ambassador Gray, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
As we speak today, we are looking in the rearview mirror, if you will, at the State Department's reductions in force and other staff reductions. You're part of a group of over 1,200 senior diplomatic officials who have expressed concern about the State Department's restructuring and staffing. What are the basic issues that you and this group are putting forward?
I think that the most important issue is the national security of the United States of America. And the question that I believe the people who implemented these cuts so recklessly did not pose to themselves is really the question that Secretary Rubio said would guide and should guide State Department decisions and policies going forward. He said this in his remarks to State Department employees on his first full day on the job when they welcomed him in the C Street lobby. And what he said was that the decisions to be made the questions to guide those decisions should be, did they make the United States stronger? Did they make the United States safer? And do they make the United States more prosperous? And I think when we look at all of these cuts and how they were, in many cases, very arbitrarily implemented, the answer, unfortunately, to all three questions is no. I can give you some very specific examples. One is the cutbacks of about 20% in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Now, this is the bureau that, as the assistant secretary in Trump's first administration, in other words, a Trump nominee, wrote in the Washington Post on July 22nd, this is the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, or INR, is the entity in the intelligence community that spoke out against the invasion of Iraq in 2002. They explained what the downsides would be. That was just one example she used in her op-ed. But when you're cutting off an independent voice like that, there's no question that the quality of intelligence and therefore the quality of policy is going to suffer. Another example is eliminating the Office of Visa Fraud and Prevention. Why, especially for an administration that professes to be so concerned about illegal immigration, why are we cutting off the Office of Visa Fraud? We want to make sure our visa system has real integrity to it. So those are just two examples. I mean, there's several others that I could give, but those are two examples.
You yourself served in senior State Department positions and as an ambassador. Are there any issues here that you would see impacting the daily operations of, say, an embassy?
Certainly, that's a very good question, and I'm glad you realize the sacrifices that people overseas serving our country make, civilians as well as military. Well, like I said, one of the big responsibilities of any embassy is granting visas and making sure that process goes well. And as I just mentioned, the Office of Visa Fraud Prevention has been eliminated. Another office that was completely eliminated is the Office of Casualty Assistance. This is the office that provides support for the families of State Department employees who have died in the line of duty overseas. I've had far too many of my friends and colleagues die serving their country, and now their families no longer receive the support because of these budget cuts and, in my opinion, irrational firings and eliminations.
I'm speaking with Ambassador Gordon Gray. He's the Kuwait Professor of Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Affairs at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. So, sir, let me ask you, there are still open litigation questions about some of the administration's downsizing efforts, but assuming that these hold with the State Department, how long might it take to build a pipeline back of folks with foreign service expertise?
It's going to take several years, and that gets back to the point I was making about the randomness of many of the reductions in force. People were identified for reduction in force based on where they happened to be assigned on May 29th. So if you were a senior officer who spoke Mandarin Chinese fluently and happened to be assigned in the wrong office at the wrong time, you were identified to be fired, even if you had a thoroughly outstanding performance record. And that's just not the way to make policy. Looking ahead, I'm also very concerned that young people coming into the State Department are going to be dissuaded from following careers of public service. We have far too many challenges globally right now that we cannot afford not to have the very best, the very most committed, working for the American people. And I've already had students who have who saw the rifts coming. They left the State Department because they didn't want to take their chances with an arbitrary system. It pained me to do so, but my advice to them was, you're doing the right thing.
Well, you mentioned the challenging international security environment. As you've looked at these plans, are there particular regions or areas or topical areas where we have ceded ground through these reductions?
Well, I think across the board where we've ceded ground is in reductions or complete eliminations in programs that promote U.S. soft power. And those are beyond the immediate scope of the State Department reorganization, but they include the virtual elimination of the Agency for International Development, the virtual elimination of Voice of America and other foreign broadcasting elements of the U.S. government. And, no surprise, the Chinese are filling the void. They're filling the void gleefully, and that just doesn't serve American interests.
How would you like to see Congress get involved?
Well, I'd like to see Congress get involved. That's the problem. Congress has ceded the power of the purse. They have rolled over, is I think perhaps the most polite term I can think of, in reversing course on programs that they had supported, that they had voted for, that had bipartisan support. I mean, Secretary Rubio is a prime example of that. If you compare what Senator Rubio said in support of a vigorous human rights policy, the importance of soft power, the importance of development assistance, those are all 179 degrees, if not 180 degrees, opposed to what the policies he's implementing now.
I've been speaking with Ambassador Gordon Gray. He's the Kuwait Professor of Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Affairs at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Ambassador, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on your program.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.
What makes a great leader in government? Christine Harada joins WEPA CEO Shane Canfield to reflect on her journey from aerospace engineering to the White House. In this episode, she shares lessons on public-private collaboration, leading with purpose, and why service, not power, should guide leadership.
Hello, and welcome to the Lessons in Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Today, I'm joined by Christine Harada, former Senior Advisor at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy within the Office of Management and Budget. Ms. Harada, welcome, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
You spent portions of your career working in both the public and the private sector. And from your experience, what makes leadership in the federal sector different than the private sector?
At the highest level, leadership in the public sector is very fundamentally at its core mission-driven. Right? The work is in the service of the public good, and the goals and the programs are frequently long-term, they're systemic, and they're incredibly complex. And success, isn't necessarily measured by quarterly earnings. We don't have that kind of drumbeat, but certainly more by the lasting impact that we have on Americans' lives. What's also unique about public sector is, in my view, the profound sense of history that you feel. And I think certainly I was very aware about the work that I was doing and how it builds on the efforts of those who came before me, and that future generations of leaders also depend on the decisions that were being made today. And that, for me, certainly provided a greater weight of responsibility.
That's a wonderful answer. And I was in the private sector for much of my career, and now WEPA is a nonprofit, and I really relate to what you said about being mission-driven rather than profit-driven. You've got a long-term view, and always at the core of it is serving others.
Yes.
Is there a moment that stands out to you from early in your career that influenced your leadership style later on?
I started out my career as an aerospace engineer, building satellites and airplanes. And when I first entered the workforce, my organization at the time had 120 people. We were a large company, 120 people, 4 women, and I was the only woman of color. I was also the youngest throughout the entire organization. And so, I remember having an experience when I was doing some engineering work. We had a design review, and I had seen some issues with the flight software that I pointed out. At the time, they're like, maybe it's not really that big of a concern. I was like, but in my heart, I knew that the issue was real and stayed with it. And sure enough, a few weeks later, that topic came up again and we addressed it. Turns out my concern did indeed prove to be valid. And so it's just one of those experiences that really sank into me around ensuring that I am listening to everybody, period, end of story, within the organization. Really thinking through about how do we take into consideration opinions from all different spectra. As a third-generation Japanese American, right, I was raised to be humble, keep your head down, and work hard, etc. But at times, leadership also requires you to speak up, do so politely, with courage, etc. Even though you may be the only voice in your room, but certainly trust your voice. It also really helped shape my belief around diversity. DEI programs right now are viewed in a negative light. We're all mosaics, and they become better because you have those different experiences. And that's really stayed with me throughout the entirety of my career.
The diversity issue is a really big one. Coming from the insurance industry, that's an industry which is working on that. It's really a diversity of viewpoint and perspective and experiences that does influence your business. And more diverse employee bases absolutely helps. Was there a time in your federal career, perhaps when you were at OMB, that you faced what you consider a real challenge? And how did you overcome it?
One moment that really stands out in particular was when I was serving as the Federal Chief Sustainability Officer during the Obama administration. We had set, like many administrations, had set some really ambitious goals, very, very, very ambitious goals around how do we think about making the federal government's operations much more sustainable. But the challenge wasn't so much about the scale or the technical capacity of the organization. A lot of it was really centered around the funding. We overcame this largely by being very strategic, helping out with blocking and tackling with the variety of legal issues or legal questions that might have come up, like how do we address this? Certainly in the federal government, you're more often leading through influence as opposed to pure form authority, and that you really need to listen deeply, communicate clearly with folks, building out those coalitions and, engaging with your stakeholders. And I know many folks in government speak like that, but that is the truth.
As someone who's spent time in both the federal and the private sectors, what makes the relationship between the two sectors important?
Certainly, it's an absolutely essential partnership, and I would add on to that, like nonprofits or philanthropic organizations. As I mentioned before, I'm Japanese American, and in Japan there's a symbol for thunder, which looks like 3 arrows pointing, around each other in a circular pattern, kind of to represent the swirl, if you will, of clouds. And that's kind of how I view the relationship between the government, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector. The government frequently sets the vision, the policy, the direction, but of course it's the private sector that brings the capital, the innovation, the skill set, the capabilities, et cetera, to be able to execute. Partnering with that, of course, are the nonprofits who may be supporting the surrounding society. Public-private collaboration is not just about contracts or compliance, but it's also about figuring out what's your shared purpose. That's when real transformation can and does actually happen.
In life insurance, there's a concept, lifetime value, where bringing a new insured in costs a lot more money than the amount of premium. And so when you talk to commercial carriers, it's a similar kind of thing. You need to bring them into the concept that they're going to be with us 20 years, and after 5 years, you can ride through that. But it's a concept that isn't easy for commercial businesses to understand. That's a partnership too. Very, very similar. What advice would you give to somebody aspiring to become a leader in government?
There are 3 things, right? So firstly, around leadership in government, you want to make sure that you're leading with purpose. You want to stay grounded in your values, and don't underestimate the power of relationships. Remember why you entered public service in the first place, and that'll help carry you through some of the inevitable challenges that you're going to face. Making sure that you are also investing in relationships. In government, you rarely have full control, and I think this is, in my view, more important in government than perhaps in the private sector. You are frequently leading through influence. You are collaborating with very different parties who frequently have very different agendas than you do. And so building that trust, investing in building that trust and planting those seeds earlier and along the way in your career, I think is absolutely critical. And certainly last but not least, I would say, don't feel that you have to have it all figured out on day one. Absolutely stay open to the unexpected. Say yes to the opportunities that stretch you, and know that you can lead from wherever you are. It's not just about position or hierarchy. It's about the impact that you can have.
What wonderful advice, especially in today's world, which is a little topsy-turvy. Who is one person, someone you know personally or perhaps someone well-known, that's impacted your leadership style?
The leaders that particularly stand out for me are Colin Powell, a woman named Carla Harris, who was a managing director in investment banking, and then last but not least would be my father. Starting with perhaps the more famous one, Colin Powell. I read his biography, loved his perspectives and the rules of leadership that have been particularly influential for me, right? So get mad, then get over it, share the credit, perpetual optimism, a force multiplier, things of that nature. And hearing his story was certainly very inspirational for me. And so I certainly very much look up to him and as a role model. The second person that I mentioned is a woman named Carla Harris. She's an African-American woman, became a managing director at an investment bank in the 80s, at a time when there were not that many women of color in investment banking in New York. And so she's published a book called Her Pearls of Wisdom. It's one of her trademarks. She always wore a pearl necklace, and she has pearls of wisdom around how can you be authentic and build relationships to be successful in super challenging environments. And she had a lot of guidance on the importance of finding sponsors and mentors. And certainly last but not least, my father is really my why for I do a lot of the work that I do in the public sector. He started out life like many other, immigrant kids in poverty. He was a strawberry farm laborer. Japanese Americans at the time were not allowed to own the land, so we worked the land. He grew up in that kind of environment. And I just think it's absolutely neat that someone who came really he was dirt poor, to say it, and his daughter ended up working in the White House twice. It's quite the American dream, and I would very much like to have that opportunity available for other people as well.
Well, wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Christine, thank you very much for your time today and all of these learnings. It's really good, impactful. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
I'm Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Until next time on Lessons in Leadership.
Find the full podcast and future episodes of Lessons in Leadership on the Federal News Network app and anywhere you enjoy your podcasts.